After Brian Laundrie strangled Gabby Petito to death in the Wyoming wilderness, he picked up her phone and he texted her mother. He typed messages from Gabby's phone to make her family believe she was still alive. He sent texts about her grandfather. He wrote messages in her voice, her patterns, her words, while her body was decomposing in a field less than a mile away. Her mother read those texts and felt relief. That is who Brian Laundrie was. This is True Crime Explainer, where we go deeper than the headline and give victims back their story. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe right now. Because what I'm about to show you about this case, about the police who missed it, the system that enabled it, and the lawyer who helped a killer hide, is the story nobody told completely. Gabrielle Venera Petito was 22 years old. She grew up on Long Island, New York, and by the summer of 2021, she had built a small but devoted following on Instagram and YouTube, a channel called Nomadic Static, documenting the van life adventure she and her fiancé Brian Laundrie were living across America's national parks, as she was the kind of person who made the camera love her without trying. Bright. Genuine. Someone who made everyone around her feel like the most important person in the room. On July 2nd, 2021, Gabby's mother Nichelle hugged her daughter in their driveway and watched her drive away in a white Ford Transit van with Brian Laundrie. "Have so many good memories over the years," Nichelle said later, "but the one thing I hold close to me is the hug that we had before she left for the trip, in the driveway. That was the last time she held her daughter." Gabby Petito was last seen alive on August 27, 2021, at a campsite in the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming. She was 22 years old, 4 months into a road trip that was supposed to last until October. On September 11th, 11 days after Laundrie had already returned to Florida without her, her mother filed a missing persons report. Gabby Petito's body was found on September 19, 2021. The Teton County coroner, Dr. Brent Blue, determined her cause of death: blunt force injuries to the head and neck with manual strangulation. She had been lying in that wilderness for 3 to 4 weeks before she was found. She was 22 years old. She was found in the place she loved most. Now I need to take you back to August 12, 2021, 15 days before Gabby Petito was killed. Moab City Police in Utah pulled over the white transit van after a witness reported seeing a man hitting a woman near Moonflower Canyon. Officers activated their bodycams and approached the vehicle. What those cameras captured is one of the most discussed and most infuriating pieces of footage in modern true crime history. Gabby Petito was in tears. She was visibly distressed. She told officers there had been a physical altercation. She said she had hit Brian first, that she had scratched his face, that it was her fault. Here is the thing about what she said. In domestic violence situations, trained officers know that a victim's self-blame is one of the most common responses to abuse. It is not evidence of guilt. It is evidence of a pattern. Brian Laundrie had a scratch on his face. Gabby had red marks on her arm. The Moab officers separated them, took their statements, and then made a decision that would become the most scrutinized police call in this entire case. They decided not to file charges. They booked Laundrie and Petito into separate hotels for the night and sent them on their way. An independent investigation commissioned after her death found that the Moab officers had failed to follow Utah's mandatory arrest law for domestic violence, which requires arrest when officers have probable cause to believe domestic violence has occurred. The independent investigator recommended both officers be placed on probation. One of them had written in his report that the incident was a case of mental health crisis. He described Gabby as the aggressor. He cited her tears and her apologies as evidence that she was the problem. In the bodycam footage, if you watch it carefully, Gabby Petito tells a police officer she is scared, not of herself, of Brian. Nobody acted on that. 15 days later, she was dead. But the Moab stop is not even the most infuriating failure in this case, because while every news camera in America was pointed at the Carlton Reserve in Florida, where investigators were supposedly searching for Brian Laundrie, he was already dead. He had been dead for weeks, and the area where his body was eventually found had already been searched. Stay with me. Brian Laundrie returned to his parents' home in North Port, Florida on September 1, 2021. He drove Gabby's van back alone. He said nothing. On September 13, 12 days after returning, he left the house. His parents told police he had gone for a hike in the Carlton Reserve, a 25,000-acre wilderness park outside North Port. They reported him missing 4 days later. Law enforcement descended on the Carlton Reserve. Hundreds of investigators, aerial searches, ground teams, the FBI, weeks of searching, and they found nothing. Here is where it gets inexcusable. The The area where Brian Laundrie's remains were eventually found, a specific section of the Myakkahatchee Creek Environmental Park, adjacent to Carlton Reserve, had already been searched in September. The FBI confirmed it directly. The area had been part of the initial search, but at the time of that search the area was submerged, floodwater, up to 3 feet of it. Investigators searched what they could access and moved on. When the water receded, nobody went back. Somewhere in that wilderness, under 3 feet of floodwater that nobody drained, in a patch of ground that investigators had already walked away from, Brian Laundrie was already dead. And nobody went back to look. It was not until October 20th, 5 weeks after the initial search, that the Laundrie family's own attorney contacted law enforcement to say the parents wanted to return to the park themselves. Law enforcement officers were present when they did, and it was Laundrie's father, Chris Laundrie, who found his son's backpack and belongings near a dry patch of ground. Brian Laundrie's remains were found the same day. A self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, a notebook beside him, a confession inside it. The man every law enforcement agency in America was looking for was found by his own father, in an area that had already been searched, weeks after he was already dead. Let me be precise about the timeline here, because the timeline is the indictment. August 27th, Gabby Petito is killed. September 1st, Brian Laundrie drives her van back to Florida. Alone September 1st to 11th, Laundrie lives at home with his parents. He says nothing. September 11th, Gabby's mother files a missing persons report. September 13th, Laundrie leaves the family home and disappears. That is 12 days. 12 days during which Brian Laundrie, the last person known to have seen Gabby Petito alive, lived in his parents' home in Florida, attended to his normal life, and said nothing. Law enforcement had no legal basis to compel him to talk. He had not been charged with a crime. He had a lawyer, and his lawyer had advised him correctly from a legal standpoint not to say a word. The only charge ever filed against Brian Laundrie was for unauthorized use of Gabby's debit card. Think about that. A young woman was strangled to death in the Wyoming wilderness. Her killer drove her van 1,500 miles back to Florida, used her debit card for over $1,000 in purchases on the way, lived in his parents' house for 12 days while her family was frantically searching for her. And the most serious charge law enforcement could file before his death ended the investigation entirely was credit card fraud, not because investigators didn't suspect him. They did. The FBI stated publicly that the investigation quickly focused on the last person believed to see her alive. But suspicion is not a charge, and without a body, without forensic evidence, without a confession, there was no murder charge. Not yet. He was dead before that moment arrived, and with his death, whatever answers he had died with him. If the police failing Gabby at the Moab stop made you angry, and the Carlton Reserve search made you furious, then I want to talk about Stephen Bertolino. Stephen Bertolino was the Laundrie family's attorney. He spoke for them from the moment Brian returned from Wyoming without Gabby, and his handling of those weeks is something the true crime community has not stopped discussing since. Let me give you the specific things Bertolino said publicly, and the context around them. September 11th, 2021, the day Gabby's family filed a missing persons report, Bertolino released a statement. It said, "On behalf of the Laundrie family, it is our hope that the search for Miss Petito is successful and that Miss Petito is reunited with her family." That is what a lawyer says. It is not what a family says when their son's fiancée is missing. It is a statement designed to give the impression of concern while committing to nothing. While law enforcement, the public and Gabby's family were desperately searching for any information, the Laundrie family, on the advice of counsel, said nothing. Gave nothing. Gabby's stepfather Jim Schmidt said publicly that the family had texted and called the Laundries and received no response, not a word, not a location, not a direction, for 11 days. Now, I want to be fair here because fairness matters. Bertolino was doing his job. In the American legal system, a defense attorney's obligation is to their client. Brian Laundrie had a constitutional right not to incriminate himself. Bertolino was protecting that right, but here is the thing that no legal justification can fully extinguish. A 22-year-old woman was dead in a Wyoming field. Her family was calling. Her mother was texting a phone that Brian Laundrie was answering, pretending to be her daughter, and a lawyer was advising his clients to stay silent. The legal system gave him the right to do that. Gabby Petito did not have a right to be found any sooner because of it. That tension between what is legal and what is right is exactly what defense attorneys in cases like this have to live with. And it is exactly what the families of victims have to live with forever. When Brian Laundrie's remains were found on October 20th, 2021, investigators found a notebook beside his body. The FBI confirmed in January 2022 that the notebook contained written statements by Laundrie claiming responsibility for Gabby Petito's death. In June 2022, Laundrie's attorney released selected pages from that notebook. In those pages, Laundrie wrote, and I'm referencing directly from the released content, that he had acted out of what he described as mercy. That Gabby had been injured. That he ended her suffering. That account, Mercy Killing, is the version of events Brian Laundrie chose to leave behind. Here is what the coroner said. Dr. Brent Blue determined that Gabby Petito died of blunt force injuries to the head and neck, with manual strangulation. He stated that her body had been outside for 3 to 4 weeks before discovery. He noted that the location where she was found was near where she and Laundrie had been seen together. He also said something in subsequent interviews that almost no outlet covered with adequate depth. He said that the manner of her death, manual strangulation, takes time. It is not instant. It requires sustained, deliberate pressure. What Brian Laundrie wrote in that notebook and what the coroner determined in that forensic examination are two very different versions of the same event. The notebook version asks for understanding. The coroner's version describes what actually happened to Gabby Petito's body. The coroner's version is the one that matters. Gabby Petito deserved better from the Moab officers who let Brian Laundrie drive away on August 12th. She deserved better from a legal system that had no mechanism to compel a killer to speak, while her mother was still hopping to hear her voice. She deserved better from the weeks of searching that found her killer dead, his confession written in a notebook, in an area that had already been examined and walked away from. And she deserved better than a story that became so large, so viral, so consumed by the internet, that the question of who she actually was sometimes got lost inside the noise of who he was. Her name was Gabrielle Venera Petito. She was 22 years old. She loved the outdoors. She loved making videos. She loved a man who killed her, and her mother's last memory of her daughter is a hug in a driveway in Blue Point, New York, before a white van drove away. If this story moved you, say her name in the comments. Tell me which part of this case made you the most angry. Because this community always has the most important things to say about the cases that matter most. Subscribe if you haven't. Turn on notifications. The next case I'm covering will make you ask the same question this one does. Who failed her before he did? I'll see you there.